My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here at Alpine Vineyards in Alpine, Oregon, just outside Monroe. It is November 5th, 2015. We're here with Dan and Christine Jepsen. And our first question to you, as our first question is for everyone, is why wine?
To me or to Dan? I'll let you answer that one. You have the answer to that one.
Well, that's a long story. And I guess the question is, where do we begin? I think that in a nutshell, I graduated from college with a degree in chemistry in 1966 and traveled to Europe and fell in love with the very small family operations. And on my way to medical school in San Francisco, I stopped to see my dad's brother, my Uncle Chuck, in Connecticut, and he was shipping grapes from California to Connecticut in refrigerated boxcars and making wine in his backyard as a home winemaker, which was legal, with his Italian friends. And I was 21 at the time, and I tasted what he had been producing, and I said, "Boy, this is pretty good, Chuck. Teach me what you know." So he did, and as a freshman medical student in San Francisco, I made my first wine the fall of 1966 with grapes that I obtained from the Hecker Pass area in Gilroy, south of San Francisco. And every year throughout medical school, I made more wine, and I quickly learned that if you want to make good wine, you need to probably grow your own grapes, but if you don't grow your own grapes, you need to control how the grapes in the vineyard are taken care of. So after Christine and I finished a couple of years in the Peace Corps from 72 to 74, we decided that in addition to doing our medical work, that we would try to find land to plant as a vineyard, and if the vineyard looked like it was going to work, then we would start a winery. So that, in a nutshell, is how we got our start.
And Christine, you were on board for this?
Yes, I sure was.
So you were then you were not full-time vineyard at that point. You were also doing medical work as well after you started looking for this place?
Correct. We both had full careers. I'm a nurse. Dan's a physician. We did that and this simultaneously. So
tell us about finding this property that we're on now.
We actually had some contacts through the Peace Corps. A man by the name of Bob Jacobs lived in Monroe. He was an architecture student and had constructed a dome in Monroe on Orchard Tract. And we spent a few nights with he and his friend, and he said after we described what we were looking for in terms of vineyard land, we had both done a lot of research about the parameters that we were looking for, which was land on a south-facing slope between 500 and 1,000 feet in the South Willamette Valley. Those were important criteria for me, and if you're interested, we can get into why we chose the South Willamette Valley over the North Willamette Valley. But he said, "I have just the property for you," and he brought us up here because this place was part of a 390-acre ranch that had just gone on the market. And so in September of '74, we made an offer on this exact parcel that we're located on. But it took us a year before we were able to actually negotiate a sale, and we ended up purchasing in September of '75 a 90-acre parcel out of that 390-acre ranch.
Okay, so you piqued my interest. Why the South Willamette Valley?
We actually had, as I mentioned, come to Oregon in 1974 with the idea of finding work as well as finding vineyard property. Christine's roommate from nursing school was Kathy Blosser, and her brother is Bill Blosser, and we actually spent time with the Blossers at their operation. And we got to know Dickie Rath as well, and met with Chuck Corey and David Lett and David Adelsheim and the Ponzis. I asked everyone, well, why are you located up here when it appears to be a little drier in the South Willamette Valley? And they said, well, marketing was the primary reason. And I said, yeah, but Pinot Noir is a very fragile grape. It's got a very fragile skin. And if you get rain during harvest, then you're going to have lots of problems. And they admitted to that, but thought that the marketing advantage to being in the Portland area trumped my argument. But I think our decision to settle down here has actually, I think, proven to be correct, in that we tend to not have the rains. In the early fall rains tend to be delayed down here. Anyone who looks at a weather map this time of year will often see storms that brush coming in from the north, Seattle, Portland, but not making it, and the Dundee area, but not making it down to the South Willamette Valley. And that's very critical in years where the grapes ripen late. And we tend to not only avoid the early fall rains, but we also tend to ripen slightly ahead of the North Valley.
Is there anything else about the terroir or the soil climate here that's noticeably different than other parts of the Willamette Valley?
Well, I think we're very, very similar. We actually do have Jory soil on this site, which is the dominant soil in Dundee. So I think it is slightly warmer here also. I think our degree days tend to be a little bit ahead. Again, in years like the last 2 years, it doesn't matter because it's been so hot. Mm-hmm. But in those marginal years, for example, 1984, that was in the early years of the industry. On October 15th, our Pinot Noir was sitting at 21.5, and the Pinot Noir at the North Valley was at 19.5. Very few producers made red Pinot Noir in 1984 out of 19.5 bricks Pinot Noir, and they made those wines into blush wines. We saw, everyone in the industry saw a storm which was to dump about 6 inches of rain over a week period beginning around October 15th. We got half of our grapes picked before that storm hit and made a red wine, which won a medal in a competition in Washington. And we made the other half into our first blush wine, which won a gold medal at the Oregon State Fair. But in any case, I think that's those are the primary differences.
So you get your land in the mid-70s. You're both working full-time at this point. How did you go about starting the vineyard and then eventually the winery? How did that come about?
Well, I was working part-time because
okay.
We had 2 young children, or we're in the process of having 2 young children. And Dan had a really nice schedule in medicine. He worked a 48-hour shift on the weekends. So he had time during the week, and we did most of it by ourselves, enlisted a lot of friends, a lot of family, a little bit at a time.
A lot of sweat equity.
Right.
We scrounged for our original grape steaks were penny a piece used bean poles that we treated so that they would last for a few years. And
how did you split up the labor then with a young family and jobs and a vineyard to build? Did you consciously divvy up the efforts, or did it just sort of naturally happen?
I don't know. I think it more naturally happened probably. And I was more involved. I've always done all the accounting for the business, been involved on the marketing side, especially when we had 2 tasting rooms at one point. Dan definitely does more of the sweat equity out in the vineyard. I do my share during harvest, but I'm a little bit lazier in the middle of winter.
Oh, you're being too generous. Back in the early years, you were out there.
I did a lot early on, yeah.
We both had children on our back, planting vines and doing work. So no, you did a lot. as you continue with the bookend of the business.
So, was there ever a time especially in the early years, where you thought you had made a mistake, thought this was too much, thought it was the wrong industry to go into, or were you always pretty happy with the decision?
Well, I was always thankful that we weren't totally dependent on farming for our livelihoods, and knowing that we were enjoying doing this and wanted to do it, but had a fallback option too. So I don't think we ever really considered not doing it or getting out of it once we got started.
Actually, I think that in the early years it was just self-reinforcing. Every year the wines got better, the grapes matured. We planted our first 10 acres in the spring of '76. Then, as I mentioned earlier, we built our home and winery in '77, but didn't complete it until '78. So we moved out here in the spring of '78, and then planted another 10 acres between '78 and '82, and then another 6 acres in 1990. It was an exciting challenge. We first planted, even though we were betting that Pinot Noir was what was going to do well here, this was really somewhat virgin territory. When we started, there were only a handful of wineries in Oregon, but as you know now, there are several hundred. So I planted just because I grew up actually in California, and my family liked Cabernet and Chardonnay. We planted a significant amount of Chardonnay and Cabernet, as well as the Pinot Noir, in addition to white Riesling, because we felt that Riesling was going to be a good cash flow wine, which it was, and we actually had a lot of success with our Riesling. We actually planted Sauvignon Blanc, Chenin Blanc, Pinot Blanc, Zinfandel. All those have been grafted over to Pinot Noir, as has all the Riesling, simply because at this point the land is much more valuable planted in Pinot Noir. So it was not only just a fun challenge for us to see what would work here, but as you have seen, this is just physically an incredibly beautiful setting, and we just love living here. So waking up every day.
I can imagine. So you mentioned that it was Cabernet. You said we were one of the few places that grew it in the Willamette Valley. Is that correct? Cabernet?
Yes.
So how did you make it work down here?
Well, I think what one has to understand is that there are cool climates that grow Cabernet throughout the world. Of particular note is the Loire Valley in France, which is quite a bit north of Bordeaux. And there are towns in the Loire Valley that excel at cool climate Cabernets, in particular Chinon and Bourgueil. And as I mentioned to you, Rich, earlier, and Rachel, Matt Kramer is a real fan of our Cabernets, and he's likened them to the wines of Chinon and Bourgueil. So one just has to accept that Cabernet does not have to be a huge blockbuster wine. It can be a very delicious, lighter style. So that's, I think, how we've made that work.
So you had found your property here, and you'd started, and you're the first and for a long time only winery in Benton County, and you have no real close winery neighbors. So how did you, and you mentioned a lot of the early pioneers that you had met. How did you go about gaining the knowledge to plant grapes and to make everything flourish?
Well, fortunately, in the early years, the wine industry was a very collegial group. Everybody shared their knowledge. And so I did a lot of reading, and I read everything I could, and I also talked to everybody that I could. And we worked with we were members of the Oregon Wine Growers Association from its inception, and for decades, actually.
How often were you able to, with no close neighbors, how often did you see, was it monthly that you saw other winemakers? Was it more often than that?
At least monthly.
At least monthly.
We had regular OWA meetings, and we socialized And particularly as the industry just started to develop in this area, people would get together regularly too.
Excuse me. So, how has Alpine evolved over the years for you in terms of from a very small vineyard to a winery and now back to just a vineyard? How has the evolution happened?
Okay. Well, back in the decade of the 80s, we were producing 3,000 to 4,000 cases of wine per year. And we were able to market all of that wine, mostly in Oregon, a little bit in Washington, a little bit in California. We also sold a little bit in Japan through Henny Hinsdale, and in England, based on our success with our early Chardonnays. Our 1983 Chardonnay was a unanimous gold at the Enological Society, and one of the judges was a wine merchant from London, and he wanted a pallet of that wine for his London shop. So, but anyway, to answer your question more directly, it was very easy for us to sell our wine from our tasting room here, and we also had a tasting room at the Wood Gallery in Newport for, what was that, 4 or 5 years?
I'd have to look it up. It's been a while, yes. Yeah.
But it became clear in the early 90s that in order to, with the increased number of wineries in the state of Oregon, we were going to have to increasingly go out of state to sell our wine. And based on our involvement with our 2 daughters and both of our professions, full-time jobs basically, we were going to have to hire somebody to do marketing, and to afford that person we would need to expand. And we thought, well, you know what, we're pretty happy at the level we are, so we thought, well, rather than expanding and having to go out of state, let's start selling grapes. So I think 92 was the first year we sold a few grapes, and then increasingly we sold a few more each year, and then by 97 we sold, I think, all of our grapes except for half ton or a ton. Every now and then I would make the entire Cabernet crop and bottle that and still sell that through our distributor, which at that time was Lemma Wine Company in Portland. So for the past almost, roughly a decade and a half anyway, we've been pretty much exclusively a vineyard. But it's been very enjoyable to watch the industry grow, especially with the appreciation that the rest of the world has recognized the Oregon Pinot Noirs.
How did you go about, when you made that decision, how did you go about, was it easy to find buyers for your grapes? Did it happen pretty naturally that way?
Oh yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It was very, very easy.
Good.
Yeah, and in particular, although we've sold to local wineries, we've sold to Broadley, we've sold to King Estate, we've sold to Hinman. It's the wineries at the North Valley that have really valued our grapes, because, especially in the marginal years, because in years where things don't get quite as ripe as they'd like them before the rains come, they would always have a secure source of fruit from us.
Makes sense. Sorry, just totally lost the question I was going to ask there. When you were working on marketing in the early years, did you feel that you were, how were you able to compete with the kind of Portland area, the Dundee Hills? Did you feel competitive? Did you feel like you were part of the same group as theirs, or were you kind of working on your own, being so far away?
Well, it was pretty easy actually, because we were the first winery in recent history anyway in Benton County. So actually our first label had Benton County as the appellation, and then after that we said, well, no, let's use Willamette Valley, because that makes more sense in terms of overall marketing strategy. But so we had, so Corvallis was a very large market for us. Because we were the only existing winery in Benton County at the time. And then Eugene was also a very good secondary market. In terms of the Portland market, I think most wineries would agree that the reason one enters competitions is so that you have a marketing tool. And we were winning medals right out of the gate, and that gave us a foot in the door in the Portland market. We actually self-distributed for the first couple of years, and then we decided, well, we need to be able to sell wine in Portland. So Mike McMenamin, a lot of people don't know this, but Mike, before he started his restaurant business, was a beer and wine distributor. And he actually approached us right here and asked if he could be our distributor. And so we went with him for a couple of years, and then we switched a couple years later to Henny Hinsdale out of Salem, and he had a very strong presence in Portland. We were with them for many, many years, and then we switched a few years later to the Lemma Wine Company.
We've heard a lot from people who love to make wine that the selling of it is the worst part of the experience. Was that true for you?
Well, it's the hardest part, because you have to have a constant presence out there. You might do tastings with wait staff and get known in a restaurant, but there's constant turnover, and so you have to keep going back on a very regular basis. So I would say marketing probably was the most challenging part for us, especially with other jobs. If we had been able to devote full time to marketing, It would have been a little bit easier.
Yes, I would second that, and I would say that when we did our initial research, I knew almost to the penny what it was going to cost to plant this vineyard. I knew what it was going to cost to make the wine. I had no idea what it was going to cost to sell the wine. And I'm sure you've heard that from other people in our business. But, so yeah, that was a pretty sharp learning curve on that.
So how did you go about developing that strategy then? How did you figure out how to sell it at the most efficient way?
By doing.
Just by doing?
Yeah, by doing it.
Knocking on a lot of doors,
Yeah.
Getting in, identifying key restaurants and wine shops and getting into those places, obviously using any awards that the wines had won as a nice marketing tool.
And also learning that we were going to have to hire somebody who was really knowledgeable in wine if we were going to make the expansion that we thought was necessary. We learned pretty quickly that there's no alternative to expertise. And although we have expertise, we have limited time. So.
Are there any, as you talked about the competitions and winning medals, are there any awards you're particularly proud of, or any wines you're particularly proud of?
You go with that one.
Actually, I'm proud of every wine we've ever made. We've only made estate bottled wines. A lot of people don't know what estate bottled means, but you have to grow the grapes. The winery has to grow the grapes on on land they own or lease, and therefore control within 5 miles of where the processing facility is. So we've only done estate bottled wines throughout our entire history. And to answer your question about wines we're really proud of, in terms of medals, we won the Best of Show for our 1982 White Riesling at the Tri-Cities wine competition in Pasco. Our 1983 Chardonnay was the only wine to win a unanimous gold at the Enological Society in 1984, or I think it was 84 or 85. Wow. But in any case, that wine did very well, and that was the wine that the wine buyer from England took back to his wine shop. And then our 1983 Pinot Noir did very well in the Burgundy Challenge, tied for third in the second tasting done in 1985 in a blind tasting. So. But we've won gold medals on multiple Pinot Noirs. Our, let's see, 82 Pinot Noir at State Fair, 86 Pinot Noir at the International Wine Review, 1990 Pinot Noir at the Enological Society. These are all listed in the. I gave you a list of all the.
Excellent.
All the medals that we've won. So.
So you've been in the industry for much of its, you came in when it was very young, it was very small. So you've seen a lot of the milestones of Oregon wine. Are there particular moments that stand out to you in terms of Oregon wine entering into the mainstream or entering into the consciousness, or are there particular moments that stand out to you for the industry as a whole? Or even for your own, for yourselves, for Alpine and specifically also?
Well, probably the Burgundy Challenge that
Burgundy
you were
Challenge
talking
was a
about
big
earlier.
one. Although it took the world quite a while to catch up with that. It wasn't until I would say the early 90s, early to mid 90s, that we really turned the corner, and that Oregon, the world started to appreciate the quality of the wines coming out of Oregon. I think, for example, when the Terroir family purchased land up in Dundee, that was a turning point. Steve Gerard of Benton Lane Winery had a 15,000 case Cabernet winery in the Napa Valley, and he came up here in 1984, and he and his wife Carol had a lunch with us, and he asked me, Dan, why are you down here at this end of the valley? And I explained the reasons that I've already explained to you, and he said, well, you know, he'd done this similar evaluation, and he agreed with me. And that's why he purchased a 2,000-acre piece of property on Sunny Mountain, which is just 5 miles away. The crow flies right over the hill there to our southeast, and planted a 100-acre vineyard. And he's done quite well.
So as the area filled in, as Benton County became more, did you feel like you were kind of the elder statesman of the area? Did a lot of people come to you for advice or for grapes or for anything else?
Well, not only advice, but for cuttings. So yes, a lot of the vineyards in the South Willamette Valley have come from our place.
So let's go back a little ways. We're gonna jump back in history a little bit here. How did you two first meet?
We both went to UC Medical Center in San Francisco. Dan was in medical school and I was in nursing school.
And then you went into the Peace Corps together.
We did. Right after we were married, we were in West Africa. We were in what was then Zaire for 3 months. Dan was a Peace Corps doctor, I was a Peace Corps nurse, and then we were in West Africa and lived in Senegal, covered Mali, Mauritania, Gambia, and Senegal.
And so being married and being in the same business together has to be somewhat difficult at times. We know that not a lot of relationships have survived the wine industry in the area. So how did you two make it work?
We have a pretty good division of labor, and I think we've figured out over the years. You know, we each have our own areas of expertise, and I don't know, it's worked fine.
Well, you know, we have 90-acre property, and we each have our own space. No, I think division of labor is the secret, and a division of responsibility.
So are there any crossovers from working in the medical industry and working in wine, or is there anything that you find, any similarities you find, any crossovers between the two?
I don't know, there are a lot of people in the medical field that are also in the wine industry. I'm not sure what the correlation is. We were lucky in terms of our careers to have some flexibility in our schedules so we could do the wine industry at the same time.
Well, I think attention to detail. I think even though winemaking is fairly basic biochemistry, hygiene, cleanliness is really important in the winery. And if you don't appreciate those, then you're going to make some pretty grave mistakes in your winemaking. And so I think that's probably the greatest similarity, is that you have to really be attentive to every step in the process. And not just in the winery, but also in growing the grapes, in terms of making sure that your grapes are clean when they come into the winery. Clean from the standpoint of not having botrytis or powdery mildew, which powdery mildew ruins your wine, and botrytis ruins a lot of wine. So.
As you were growing, did you ever Was there ever help brought in? Were you two doing most of the labor and bringing in help for harvest, or did you have full-time people helping?
We've had help year-round for many, many years, part-time, but several different people. And then we bring in a lot of local high school students during the summer. And then we bring in contract labor particularly for harvest, but sometimes for other pulling brush or something major, we'll bring in a crew for a few days. And we had some marketing help many years ago too.
And of course, when we had our tasting rooms, we had help because we were open virtually every day from May 1st to October 31st, and then on holidays.
And at the coast, we were open year-round.
Year-round daily, actually, except for a couple of days, Christmas. But we've transitioned though into having, now that I'm retired from medicine, to just having two half-time people most of the year, but there are some quiet periods. For example, now nobody's working except for me out there, and but with those two people half-time, and they're both local, it's worked very well for us.
So how much of your daily time do you devote to keeping the vineyard afloat?
Well, it varies by season. Right now it doesn't take much. For example, I was out actually working on the non-vineyard portion of the property the last week, clearing blackberries and Scotch broom. So, as I said, they're big piece of property. So.
But during the summer, it's pretty labor intensive, and then pruning. Those are the two big times.
Yeah, and I never answered that question. Yeah, during this summer, I'm out there 4 to 8 hours a day, and during pruning, I'll be out there with my crew of 2 guys, probably for 5 or 6 hours a day. And it'll take us, the 3 of us working together, about 1 month to do the actual pruning. And we used to do all the brush pulling ourselves, but that's a very tough job, and neither of them really enjoy it. So we bring in a contract labor crew that does it every day, and in 2 days they have the whole 26 acres pulled to brush, and then I can put the flail mower in the back of the tractor and chop it all up. And then things are pretty quiet until things start to grow again.
So do you have any other interests outside of, do you have time for any interests outside of wine and work and family? Do you, other things you enjoy in the area?
In the area?
Or just other things you enjoy?
There are a lot of things we enjoy. We love to travel, so we do a fair amount of that. Our travel schedule is somewhat dependent on what's needed in the vineyard. Dan's a cellist. We have a social life that we enjoy.
We like to go to plays. We spend a lot of time with our grandkids, who we have 5.
And they're all
2
in
daughters.
Portland.
Yeah.
So we know I-5 really well.
Do you have a succession plan? Is any family interest in the property?
Not at this point, only because their careers they're very busy with their full-time careers and young children. So I think they would like to, but probably realistically, we don't have a family member that's at this point wanting to take over the vineyard.
Let's just say the succession plan is evolving. One of our sons-in-law did actually work on the vineyard with us for 6 years, a day a week, and I think he would like to, but things are evolving, so we can't answer that question with finality at this point.
The grandkids are a little bit young, but maybe down the road. They love to come out here. One of them will be interested. We'll see.
So you'd like to keep it in the family if you could?
If we could.
If there's an interest. Yeah.
So looking back, what is the most important thing you've learned in the industry, or if you answer a different way, if you could do one thing over again, what would you do differently?
Well, I wouldn't do anything differently. I might, when we planted the vineyard, I used the trellising system that was used then. If I were to expand, I would probably use a different trellising system. It would still be the upright vertical trellis, but I would probably use metal stakes instead of wooden posts. But these are minor things.
I think one thing I learned, I grew up in San Francisco, so I really had never had any farming experience at all. It gave me such an appreciation for people that farm full time and how much work it really is.
And picking up on that, my dad and his brother and two sisters grew up on a farm north of Spokane. They didn't have electricity until after my dad went off to college. It wasn't until the 40s that this town of Springdale was electrified, or at least the rural part of Springdale, Washington, was electrified. And but I would spend all my summers growing up working on my grandparents' farm, and I fell in love with that kind of life. So, and I'm somebody who really does need to be physically active, which is why one of the reasons I wanted to do the vineyard is that it gave me that opportunity to do something useful with the energy that I felt needed to be expended. In fact, I ran cross country in college, and one year my granddad was down visiting our family in Los Altos, and I went off to run at the local high school before I went back to college for I think it was my junior year, and my granddad said, "Dan, why are you doing this?" And I said, "Oh, just because I got to get in shape." He said, "Well, you're wasting a lot of energy. Why aren't you out here hoeing or building a fence or doing something useful on your parents' property?" Anyway, and he's been here. He actually helped lay that brick walkway with my dad and me and one of our daughters helped lay that walkway.
It must be pretty awesome to have so many different people in your family having touched a part of this property, like as you were creating. That's really neat.
Mm-hmm.
Well, family and friends. In fact, that brings up something that I wanted to mention, and we talked about a little bit earlier before we started filming, and that is that I had a colleague at the University of Oregon Health Center that was very interested in what we were doing out here. In fact, he came out and helped us plant our first 10 acres. And at the end of that time, later in that summer, he said, "Dan, can you help me acquire the 26 acres of land next to you?" His name is Frank Baines. His family's name in Scotland was Woodhall. And so I helped him negotiate the purchase of the neighboring property. And he and his wife Betty planted 10 acres of vines on the property, with the idea that they were going to possibly start a winery, but unfortunately Betty developed leukemia and passed away. But before she did pass away, she and Frank agreed to give the property to Oregon State as a research station, which it is currently today. And in fact, both Frank and Betty are buried up there. Anyway, he, in addition to our family, he helped a lot. I also need to mention our parents. They moved up from California and lived in Eugene for 4 or 5 years, and were out here helping us in the early years of the vineyard, both in terms of the vineyard labor, as well as they helped in the tasting room, and they went to marketing events for us. So, yeah, we had a lot of help.
That's really awesome. So the Woodhall Research Facility, is it wine research or so
Vineyard
research and still being used today?
Oh yeah, and they actually make wine out of the grapes that are over there for wine trials. The clonal block where they brought in many of the newer clones from France. The 777s, etc. The mother block was established at Woodhall 20 years ago. And they've since ripped that out, and now they were replacing that with a trellising trial to see actually what happens with the various trellises that are out there, the Scott Henry, the upright like we have, and the hanging curtain. Anyway, they're studying every conceivable trellis next door. Well, that trial has just gone in, They do not have phylloxera. We do not have phylloxera, but they do have a rootstock trial up there that's been going on for, I would say, a decade or so now, where they have various rootstocks, and they have grafted certainly Pinot Noir of various clones, Chardonnay, and I think beyond that I'm not sure, but they are studying the quality of the wines that are coming out of various rootstocks with the European grape varietals on top of grafted onto those rootstocks.
That's really cool. You mentioned being part of the Oregon Wine Growers Association from the beginning. I'm curious we're always curious to hear what that was like, especially as it was getting started, how it worked, what the atmosphere was like, what the collegiality was like, how you all worked together.
Well, it was fun. We had
it was very social.
fairly social meetings, but we worked together on a lot of things. I mean, marketing in particular, we focused on events that would market the region, not just necessarily one winery. So we did some flyers, some literature together, we did events together, and we shared a lot of information. It was a nice way especially as people were just coming in, and some of us had been here a little bit longer, to benefit from what we'd learned and our mistakes too.
I think everybody wanted to see the industry prosper, and the idea was that if anybody's putting bad wines out there, then they needed to be aware that there were flaws in those wines, and that those wines were going to hurt the industry. So I think everybody was concerned about quality, which was really nice. It wasn't that it brought everybody together instead of having 30 or 40 different wineries going in every direction. We were all banded together, and we're focusing our energy to growing the industry.
Are there any personalities that stand out from those early meetings? Any particular moments in particular that you remember?
Well, let's see. From this end of the valley, Doyle Hinman was a real firecracker. He was just a
nice guy,
barrel of energy.
Yeah.
Nice guy, wonderful to work with. Bill Blosser at the North Valley. I would say those two were the standouts for me, anyway. And Dick Ponce also was very, very wonderful to work. Everybody was wonderful to work with, but in terms of energy, those were, I think, the ones that I recall. That was a while ago. That was 4 years ago.
I know. I can't remember back that far.
Did it feel at the time like it was a fairly equal playing field for all of you? Did it feel like there were certain people trying to make decisions for the rest of you, or did you feel like you all had a pretty equal input into the future of the industry?
I felt like everybody had an input. Everybody was valued. I felt like it was a very open process.
It's always struck us as interesting because it's so many big and unique personalities getting together and coming up with some of the ideas you guys came up with is fascinating. We're always interested in the process of how it happened. So in your mind, what does the future of Oregon wine look like?
Well, I think it looks very promising. I always look for Oregon wines no matter where I am traveling, if I'm ordering wine with dinner.
Well, I have told many people this, that I believe that in 100 years, every south and southeast facing slope in the Willamette Valley, on the west side of the Willamette Valley on the foothills of the Coast Range, not too far into the Coast Range, because if you get too far into the Coast Range, then you're going to get out of the inversion zone, which we can talk about also. But I predicted that in 100 years, instead of seeing Douglas fir planted on all these south and southeast facing slopes, you're going to see vineyards. So I think you're going to see, even with global warming, because I think global warming is happening, but I think it's going to happen very slowly. In fact, I just read Greg Jones's report yesterday, and this surprised me. But his report was that the degree days for the Umpqua and the Rogue increased by 6% over even last year, the hottest year on record. In the Willamette Valley, it decreased 2% over last year, which really surprised me. So all I'm saying is that I think that this is going to continue to be a Burgundy-like area, and in terms of being able to grow wonderful Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays and Pinot Gris for decades. But I really do think that the industry is just in its infancy. I think the wine industry, I think, is good. It's a good industry for the planet. I mean, these grapevines produce, a lot of good, or they consume a lot of carbon dioxide, and I think it's just a wonderful industry if one practices good farming techniques.
Do you see any potential pitfalls? Are there anything that Oregon wine industry has to be careful to do or not to do?
As I mentioned, I think we have to really husband the land well and not over fertilize, not use chemicals that are harmful. We started out being totally organic, and we made the decision that we would rather be minimalists than what we do, and that has worked for us.
So you mentioned the inversion zone. So tell us more about that.
Okay. Between the Willamette Valley is a box canyon with the Coast Range, which we're sitting in here on the west, and the Cascade Range on the east. And on the very cold, clear nights and mornings where it's freezing at the valley floor, warm air rises, and the valley floor is at roughly 300 feet. Between 500 and 1,000 feet, there is a warm pocket of air. If there's wind, that's disrupted, but if there's a wind, you're probably not going to have a freeze at the valley floor.
Sure.
But on those cold, clear nights, that inversion zone gives you a warm pocket, and you don't have a freeze. We have never had a freeze between April 1st and October 31st. On our vineyard.
Wow.
Because we are in the inversion zone. You go another mile or so into the Coast Range, and you will be out of that inversion zone because of the valleys, etc. In fact, there have been vineyards planted further west of us and to the south that I actually worked as a consultant on a few occasions for people, and I've recommended that perfect site, but don't buy this because it's going to be out of the inversion zone. I'm not going to name names, but that piece of property was purchased, and it turns out they eventually abandoned it because they had lost too many crops to frost. So what being in the inversion zone does is it gives you a longer growing season. And that growing season between April 1st and October 31st.
So you've been a consultant before. If someone came to you today and said that they wanted to start a vineyard in Oregon, what would your advice be?
Well, that they find a south or southeast facing slope with appropriate soil. Grapes only need 16 inches of rain per year. Yeah. Dry farming is a lot easier than irrigating, and I think it gives you a better idea what your terroir is also if you are dry farming, although there's nothing. I can understand why people irrigate also. But so you need a soil, for example, Jory soil has 4 inches of moisture holding capacity per foot. So all you need is 4 feet of soil. Well, Jory is a 10 to 50 foot soil. And so, that's why our average rainfall here is 44 inches a year. We never have to worry about water. We irrigate our vineyard. We've irrigated the very first year that we plant a vine. We give each vine about 1 gallon twice throughout the growing season the first year, and then they're on their own, and every vine's done fine. So basically I'd say to anybody wanting to start out, research it very carefully. Oregon State University has put out a very wonderful book on grape growing, and I think they should read that. That would be my advice, really. But the most important thing is finding the right site. But that reminds me of a funny story. I asked Bill Blosser when we first met. I said, Bill, what advice would you give me for planting a vineyard? And he said, keep your rows straight. And that was some of the best advice I ever got, because I was really careful with my planting lines, and we did keep the rows straight, and that really pays off, because I do all the machine work in the vineyard. Except at harvest, I let one of my guys drive the second tractor to pull the bins out to the truck that we're sending up to the wineries that we're selling at too. But yeah, I've spent, let's see, I know exactly how many hours I spent, because I know the hours on the tractor. I've spent about 10,000 hours on tractors over the last 40 years.
It's a good thing those rows were straight.
Very good. Would have taken out a few more poles.
Yeah.
All right, Christine, I have to ask you the same question. If someone came to you and asked about starting a winery or vineyard, what would you tell them?
I'd tell them to do a lot of homework, especially if you don't have a farming background, that it's very labor intensive. It's good to have a nice source of funding to help you, because it takes several years before you'll get much return on your investment.
What about from a family standpoint?
I think it's a great place to raise a family. Our kids loved growing up here. Our grandkids love to come here, and they like to bring their friends out. So I think from that standpoint, it's very nice.
Anything else? Okay, that's all the questions I have. Is there anything that I have forgotten to ask that I should have, or anything else you'd like to add?
I think you asked a lot. I don't know. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, but we want to thank you for the opportunity to tell our story.
And I'm impressed that you're doing this for the whole wine industry. I think it will be important
Thank you.
down the road to
I think
have
so
these
too.
archives.
I think I would also just say that the vineyard and wine industry in Oregon is just a very fun industry, and would welcome all newcomers.
Excellent. Okay, with that, we'll stop the formal part of the interview.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah.